Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome back to Chapter 17. We are doing the survey of life, and we're currently talking about plants. We just talked about what plants needed to become, to live on land, to come out on land. Now let's talk about the simplest of plants. Remember, that is the strategy that we're using for discussing the survey of life. We're talking about least complex to most complex. So we're talking about the least complex plants now, and the least complex plants are mosses. Mosses are called bryophytes. There's only about 20,000 species of mosses. 20,000 sounds like a lot, and depending on what you're talking about, it is a lot. But when you're talking about species of a whole phylum of animals, it's not that many. Bryophytes, mosses are very small, and they can't transport water. That's why they're very small. They don't have true roots. A true root absorbs water from the dirt and then transports it throughout the rest of the plant. And mosses don't have true roots. They have what are called rhizoids. Because they don't have vascular tissues, because they can't transport water throughout their bodies, they have to be really small. And because every tissue has to be absorbent, because they have to be able to absorb water directly from around them. And where do you find mosses? You find mosses in damp places. They don't get very tall. What the old saying is that to be able to find out how to get out of the forest is you look for the moss, because the moss grows on the north side of the tree. It's on the north side of the tree because that's the shady side of the tree, which doesn't get as hot, which means there's more water. It doesn't evaporate as quickly. Don't use that to get out of the forest. Just use your GPS. Like I said, all moss tissues have to be absorbent because they can't transport water. So here you see a bed of moss. In lab, we will look at mosses more up close, and you can see what you see is this little carpet of moss is really, if you get way down on the almost microscopic level, what this would actually look like is each of these little dots that you see is a single individual little moss plant. This is basically a carpet of thousands of individual little moss plants, and each individual little moss plant looks like a tiny little pine tree. So if I get down on the near microscopic level and look at this bed of moss, I would see a giant forest covered in tiny little trees. Here we see a closer up view. Again, I think I said this in the previous chapter. I'll go ahead and say it now. Try, when you're watching these videos, do try to have the PowerPoints up on another device so that you can look at these pictures in more detail than what you see on the videos. But on this picture right here, what we see is, this is a close-up view from the top down. This is a close-up view of what a moss plant looks like. And there's dozens of moss plants in this one little view. But again, this right here, imagine you're looking at a pine tree from the top down, and that's what I see. I see little branches come off, and each little branch has leaves on it, and each one of these is a tiny little Christmas tree growing. What we see over here is these stalks that are growing up like this. This is another life stage of mosses. Plants do something called alternation of generations, which means one generation will have 2 copies of every chromosome, and then the next generation will only have 1 copy of each chromosome, and then the generation after that will have 2 copies. It alternates. 2 copies of each chromosome, 1 copy of each chromosome. In you, if humans did alternation of generations the way plants do, you would be the 2 chromosome copy. The sex cells that you make, that would be the 1 chromosome generation. It would be as though your sperm or egg had its own life and its own body. All plants supposedly do this, but to be fair, mosses are the only ones that still do this. So what we see here is, this is the 1N. It's the so-called Gametophyte Generation. the Gametophyte generation is what you think of when you're thinking of mosses. These stalks with these little caps on them, that's the Sporophyte generation. The Sporophyte generation is the 2 copies of every chromosome version. Again, if this was a human, these little stalks that you see, that's the actual person. These little pine trees, the Gametophyte generation, that would be like if the sperm or the egg had its own life, had its own body. And the way it works is that the Sporophyte generation will release spores, and these spores will be half the normal number of chromosomes. And the spores drop on the ground. You would think of them as seeds. The spores drop on the ground and they grow into the Gametophyte generation. And some of them will be male and some of them will be female. And the male will make little sperm and the females will make little eggs, and they will reproduce with one another. Sperm and egg come together. That makes 2 copies of each chromosome, and that makes the stalk generation, the Gametophyte. Alternation of generations. Alternation of generations is this process. We'll talk about it a little bit more in lab. It's only plants do it. And to be fair, of the plants that do it, mosses are the only ones that still truly do it. They say that all other plants do it, but really mosses are the only ones that still continue to do it. But that's why there's 2 different life stages. So the next time you go out and you find some moss, you're going to have an exercise where you'll have to find some moss. Look at it and you'll see these tiny little fingers, these tiny little stalks that stick up above it. That's the Sporophyte generation. And then what you think of when you think of moss, the tiny little leaves, that's the Gametophyte generation. We move on from mosses which don't have those vascular tissues and therefore have to stay really small and near the water. We move on to the Pteridophytes. The Pteridophytes are the ones that now have a method of transporting water. These are the ferns, and there's about 9,000 species of ferns. And ferns range in size from a few centimeters tall all the way up to 30 meters tall. Remember, this is science, so we use the metric system. A meter is a little bigger than 3 feet, because a meter is about a yard. That's what you should use when you're trying to transfer numbers in your head between metric and our standard system. A meter is a little bit longer. It's about 39 inches as opposed to 36 inches, but fine. So if we're saying that a fern can be up to 30 meters tall, we're saying it can be pushing 100 feet tall. 10-story building, pushing 100 feet. Pretty big. Ferns and mosses both release spores. It is inappropriate to call a spore a seed, but it is what you imagine a seed to be. Because for you, a seed is just something that reproduces the plant. I take the seed, I put it in the ground, a new plant grows, right? A seed is a special structure that specifically has 3 parts. It has an embryo inside, it has a food source for the embryo, and it has a wrapper called the seed coat. It has a wrapper around it. That is what you have to be a seed, and a spore doesn't have that. A spore is really just, it's almost not even an embryo. But a spore is essentially just the embryo with no food source and no wrapper around it. So it's really, really fragile. And it has to land in perfect conditions to be able to grow. Mosses and ferns release spores. They release these very, very simple structures. And so because it takes perfect conditions for a spore to grow, they release thousands of them. You know, what are the chances one is going to find the perfect conditions? The chances of anyone finding the perfect conditions is really low. So I release a whole bunch of them, hoping that at least one will find the perfect conditions to grow. So they release spores. A spore is not a seed, but you can kind of imagine it is sort of, it has the same purpose as a seed, and that is to reproduce the plant, to reproduce the structure. This is a picture of a fern. You might have one of these in your house. This is specifically a Boston fern. People get these and grow these all the time. They're very simple plants. They don't make flowers, they don't make cones, they make these things called spores. If I were to take this leaf and flip it over and look on the underside, I would see these structures here. You see these tiny little brown dots? These tiny little brown dots are called sori. Those tiny little brown dots are called sori. Their job is to make spores. And remember, the spore is the structure that's going to reproduce the fern plant. And each little brown dot is not a spore. Each little brown dot will release dozens of spores. And how many brown dots do you see on the underside of this leaf? And the answer is a bunch. I see a bunch of brown dots on the underside of this leaf. And each brown dot will release dozens of spores. These structures are called sori. So we said that ferns can be from a few centimeters tall up to 30 meters tall. This right here is a fern. A big, big, big fern. It's a whole tree that is a fern. Now I'm not sure if you can see very well in the picture to get a sense of scale, but I just want to show you. This right here is a guy. There's his baseball cap, there's his head, there's his shoulder, and there's his book bag. All right? This is the head and shoulders of a man. Here is the base of the tree where he would be standing. So if this is how tall, the size of my pinky basically, if this is 6 feet, how big is that fern? Oh gosh, it's almost 30, 40 feet tall. That's a huge fern. When you think about ferns as terms of something that grows under your steps or your mom has in a pot, some of them can get really big.